Hey there, I'm Mr. Terry, high school history teacher. Welcome back to another History Teacher Acts video. Today we are covering a video from our friend Chris Cappy over at Cappy Army. It's called U.S. Troops Deploying at Home is Worse Than You Think. So unless you've been living under a rock here in the U.S., or if you're not from the U.S., the National Guard has been deployed on a few cases of going into cities in the United States to thwart domestic violence and to support ICE, the immigration agency, in their deportation of undocumented immigrants in the United States. And we'll see what kind of take Chris has here. I'm hoping to get opportunity to talk about precedent and context of when troops have been deployed inside of the United States. This video is going to be linked down below. Chris has been very supportive over here. Please support his channel. And let's get started. So like I said, I'm hoping to find opportunities where I can talk about historical examples of when deployment of troops in basically our own country has happened before. And I thought I have going into this, and maybe Chris will kind of give opinions about that, is what precedent do you think this could set for the deployment of troops in the future? Will this be used as precedent for future political leaders to do things similar for whatever things are part of their, political platform? You let me know what you think down below. Make sure to be respectful, though. Here we go.
Right now, thousands of American troops are deploying to American cities around the country. One of these soldiers is named Adam Reyes. Let's say he's 19 years old, from a quiet suburb in Illinois. Adam enlisted in the National Guard a year ago as a way to serve his country one weekend a month, and to help pay for classes at Northern Illinois University.
So if you did not know, being in the National Guard is not a full-time job, at least once you get trained. And it's seen as a path for, I guess, kind of like military service or public service that way, without going to the depths that it is of enlisting as like a full-time soldier in the Army or Navy. And again, some of the benefits, you're going to get tuition help for college, earn job skills, and network that way.
On October 5th, Adam got a text message from his squad leader that read, "Report to the Armory. We're going to Chicago to protect federal facilities and agents downtown." It felt surreal to Adam because growing up, Chicago was the city where he and his family went every year to watch the Thanksgiving Day parade. It was where he and his buddies went on the weekends for concerts and parties. Now he was going there as a soldier to possibly stop riots and be issued live ammunition. That night, Adam sat at his desk and started writing emails to his professors, explaining that he might miss the rest of the semester. Across the whole country, thousands of part-time citizen soldiers were doing the exact same thing, calling off from work, rearranging childcare to fulfill their commitment.
National Guard deployment to the Chicago.
So yeah, basically you're on call, at a minute's notice. One of the contexts that is probably you've seen most common in the United States of deploying of National Guard is in natural disasters. When there have been devastating like hurricanes, earthquakes, or fires, or even like with the COVID pandemic, National Guard troops were deployed to help serve, provide rescue, provide relief, and things like that. So that's been probably the most common one you've seen, probably, and we've seen in American history. But there are other incidents, and I'm hoping to get some more chances to talk about that too. We'll see.
Chicago area has begun in controversy over its constitutionality.
Hundreds of troops from the Texas and Illinois National Guard are now positioned to deploy across the Chicago area.
On October 5th, the White House federalized and deployed 300 National Guard troops from Illinois and 400 from Texas to the city of Chicago. So far in 2020.
Now, they've done that in Washington, D.C. too. That was one of the places that was among the first for the idea of deploying troops in cities that have high crime rates. That's at least been what's been talked about, especially by President Trump, who was has ordered this, is tried to quell violence in these cities. But there has, of course, been an incredible amount of pushback. One of the criticisms, especially on in the political realm, is the deployment of these troops are in democratic states. Controversy being that there are high crime cities in, red states or, conservative, or the states that have voted Republican largely. That's been the big kind of political slant you might be hearing in the media.
25, the White House has deployed 4,000 National Guard soldiers and 700 Marines to Los Angeles, 2,000 to Washington, D.C., over 100 to Tennessee, and there are now plans to activate the National Guard in 19 more states.
The one you probably heard about in Southern California was during the anti-ICE protests. And then the National Guard was deployed there to prevent things like vandalism or violence.
In places like Portland and Chicago, governors are suing to block the deployments
Portland's
and
kind
arguing
of been
they're
a new one.
unconstitutional. In response, the federal government is threatening to go around them by invoking the Insurrection Act. Meanwhile, Adam's mom texted him links to stories from the news. Some articles called the National Guard's deployment heroic, others called them pawns in an authoritarian power grab. Adam had never thought much about politics his whole life. He didn't like watching the talking heads on the news channels, and he wasn't the type of guy to argue with you about immigration or crime. But now, he and his unit were at the center of one of the most controversial and politically sensitive military missions in recent history.
And that's the difference, and maybe it puts some of these National Guard soldiers in predicaments, is being deployed in something that's going to be viewed as much more political, as compared to, again, being deployed to give out, fresh water because there was a hurricane or an earthquake, or get supplies because there were, wildfires.
This channel isn't political. It's not my place to tell you what to think. My purpose here with this channel is to cover issues of national security and discuss it here in the comment section with you. I'm a former Army National Guard soldier who deployed to both Iraq and domestically to New York City to respond to looting alongside police during a hurricane. I have some personal experience with the type of challenging missions that these troops are tasked with.
Deployed locally.
It's my goal to explain the facts of the situation, to put it into historical context, and hopefully be a resource for troops and civilians to better understand what's happening in America.
I'm so glad, channels like this show how important context is, because when you see events like this, to really get the full picture and to know what the impact can be, you have to know what things have been similar in history, whether it's for good or whether it's been for bad. Otherwise, you really don't have a full picture and you really don't have an informed opinion on it.
And something that's more detailed and complete than a 3-minute spot on a news network can be. Because behind these domestic deployments is something much bigger. A continental military operation stretching from Los Angeles to Venezuela, one that is aiming to redefine what national security means at home.
And dare I say, extending to like the Middle East, going towards Iran, right? There were strikes, nuclear facilities in Iran, in Yemen against the Houthis. And of course, recently I've also been kind of covering and talking about context of what was going on with Venezuela as well. And of course, all the border stuff. That's been some of the earliest of the deployment here that we've seen in Trump administration is for the border crossing dilemmas.
And tests just how far federal powers can reach inside the United States.
Right.
But before we dive deeper into that, I want to thank this episode's sponsor, Supremacy World War III, for sponsoring the 3D animation and map graphics in this video that were done by 3 separate talented editors. This video's partner is Supremacy World War III, an online PvP real-time grand strategy game that I started playing as a way to kill some downtime when I was stuck at the...
It's like we have this video that's going to talk about like the horrifying or like dangerous nature of military intervention in your country. And then there's a military game as the sponsor. Anyone see any irony in there?
The airport last month, and I found that it's actually an awesome way to unwind and de-stress. I like competing with 99 other players in real time online, and it's persistent. The matches last over the course of a couple of weeks. I freaking love the maps, you guys. These remind me of the maps that we make here on our videos. So my strategy is I build up a crazy force of over 100 modern weapon systems, including tanks, jets, submarines, and then I create a few alliances and declare war on everybody freaking else. The research tree works better than real-life military acquisition because I'm able to research more than 250 different real units. It's free, no credit card is required. Just click the link in the description. Try it out if you're looking for a fun way to kill some downtime anywhere, anytime.
Not to say it's unique. I've had, sponsorship from games and things like that, and I'll end up talking about a video that had, like horrific consequences and stuff. I'd like to hope we're all mature enough to be able to separate reality from video games.
You guys get an exclusive starter pack with 1 free seasonal unit like the Elite Frigate that's worth $25 for the next 30 days. Try it out. Back to the episode. And remember, guys, check out Supremacy World War III, the free-to-play online grand strategy game set in the modern global wars that we follow here. Personally, I'm all about building up my army, coming up with an Alexander the Great style strategy. Click my link in the description for an exclusive starter pack today. These domestic U.S. troop deployments happening today are part of a much larger federal immigration operation that...
By the way, I'd love to know if any of you are involved in these deployments or, you know, I guess involved in any of this carrying out of, I guess, you know, political or domestic policies right now. I mean, what kind of your take has been? What has been your messaging? If you have anything, you know, stories like that, please share down below.
It's been unfolding across the nation since early 2025. That's when the U.S. government began a series of mass deportation raids targeting homes and workplaces across the country. So far, more than 220,000 people have been confirmed arrested.
Really?
Roughly 60,000 are now held in detention centers, and estimates are as high as 200,000 already deported from inside the United States.
One of the other things that's kind of being protested is, well, maybe a lack of transparency about due process in these sort of arrests. You know, are these arrests that have probable cause? And what is then happening? I could have these deportations, right? What's happening, I guess, as a way for people to have the opportunity to present their cases, present documentation or anything like that. I know that's a big fear of a lot of people when they see these, that it could be done in an unconstitutional manner. I know that's a big fear of people that are fearing a government overreach.
Whatever the exact numbers are, though, one thing is for certain. It's the largest interior enforcement effort in modern American history, with the stated goal of deporting 1 million people a year, or roughly 3,000 arrests a day.
It's bigger than ever.
The initiative is known as Operation at Large. To give you a sense of its scale, according to federal reports, it combines 3,000 ICE agents, 2,000 personnel from the FBI and DEA, and eventually 21,000 National Guard soldiers to be deployed throughout the country.
Now, does this then include what they were saying about trying to do like peacekeeping in some of these cities that aren't even necessarily tied to like immigration raids or something, but like what you saw with like in Washington, D.C., which is just like, hey, there's crime in the city, trying to put a presence of some kind to, I don't know, deter from crime. Another question should be, is that going to be actually successful? Okay, you drop in a few, maybe 1,000 troops, and they kind of walk the streets of DC or something like that, or Chicago, and not necessarily because of like the ICE operations that are happening, but just like, all right, we just want to like keep the peace in the city. We'll drop in those soldiers for like a few days, have long-term effects. Like, does that then mean that like, okay, after they're gone, now there's going to be a more like a permanent peace or something like that? Or is it more about like posturing? These are the ideas you're seeing talked about, I guess, amongst dissenters and supporters of these type of actions.
The government is also expanding military bases in Florida to use as deportation hubs, reopening old detention facilities, and coordinating with El Salvador's mega prisons to handle deportees. $170 billion in funding for these enforcement and border security operations has been set aside.
Big criticism has been that, you know, deportation to like an El Salvador prison, people that aren't from El Salvador, basically outsourcing, I guess, your immigration. And then there's a lot of talk about how horrific some of these places are, especially these foreign detention centers. And what will happen to them? Is it become like, you know, slave labor, or is there some kind of pathway for them to be returned to their countries of origin? And what type of influence can the U.S. government have on these other, I guess, detention centers out of our country, if any, you know?
Making it one of the top priorities in national security. One of the main justifications provided for these troop deployments has been for them to support and protect these deportation operations.
Right.
But this isn't the first time the United States has carried out a mass deportation campaign.
Sure.
And the last time that it happened, it played out differently, but also sparked a nationwide debate over just how far federal enforcement should reach. In World War II, the US and Mexican governments actually worked together with one another to launch the Bracero program, which authorized over 5 million Mexican workers to come north into America to fill wartime labor shortages as the US men fought overseas in the war.
These pull factors the United States has engaged in multiple times in history. You had programs in the early years of colonization, basically like indentured servitude, and then to provide the base of industrial workers during the Industrial Revolution, and then the agriculture of the American Southwest building of railroad systems like the transcontinental railroad. But often those have been seen as like temporary, which can give misleading, I guess, effects for people interested in coming to the United States, where you have like a push, it's like pull factor. And then it's like, okay, no more immigration. Okay, now on immigration. Okay, now stop. Right. Oh, and now we want immigration, but now there's too much. Now, the ones they are talking about here have legal processes for them. You come through, you get documented and that sort of thing. And that is what can make this different and like these programs different than the problems being talked about immigration now that doesn't have this these processes of documentation. But then does that then become what becomes the issue? And this was debated a lot in history, that when it comes to immigrants, is the issue that people are coming into the country, or is it more of an issue of it's not documentation? Is it a clerical problem, or is it some kind of other problem, whether it's bringing people of diverse cultures, or the fact that of people that may have criminal backgrounds in other countries are not being vetted? I guess when it comes to the prioritization of what is supposed to be the problem at immigration, what is that like hierarchy of problems? What is the most problematic thing? And what is the thing that's driving it the most? That's what's such a hot debate right now, and has been a debate in all of these instances of push and pull factors of migration all throughout American history.
The program required fair wages and sanitary housing conditions for the Mexican workers. But many U.S. ranchers chose to ignore that rule and instead hired illegal labor from Mexico because it was much cheaper and didn't have those requirements.
Exactly. And that's been a major issue right now, is these working conditions. And these workers, of course, have no outlet to air grievances about working conditions or pay or something, because they can just be deported. And that's something that has been held over the heads of especially agricultural workers for, decades, is that whoever's employing them can simply say, well, if you don't like it, well, you'll be deported. And one thing that probably hasn't happened a lot is real pressure on employers, that hire undocumented workers. And maybe it's just because of the economic benefits as consumers that come from hiring this type of labor, keeps prices down, and consumers are very happy about it, kind of turning a blind eye, if you will. But that could change in the future too, if there's going to be more political and economic pressure, or judicial, I guess, pressure on employers of undocumented immigrants.
By the early 1950s, Washington moved to enforce compliance with the Braccio program. President Eisenhower appointed a retired World War II Army General, Joseph Swing, to lead a massive federal deportation campaign. In 1954, the government launched what was called Operation Wetback. Yes, that was really its official name in the newspapers and everything.
That'll become, if you don't know it, a slur.
Border Patrol and Immigration and Naturalization Service swept through neighborhoods in 12-man squads and jeeps, stopping anyone who looked Mexican and demanded identification. If they didn't have any, detainees were sent to camps and then deported by bus, train, and ship. Right. Officially, about 30,000 people were deported in just a few months, but over 1 million were ultimately apprehended. The Eisenhower administration called the operation Respect for Law, while civil rights groups called the campaign unconstitutional.
Amazing how similar, you're talking about the 50s and then into the 60s, how those exact same arguments are happening right now.
Today, we're once again seeing large-scale federal immigration enforcement, but this time something major has changed. It's backed by military deployments from the National Guard and some active duty components.
Some of this has been pushed as well as the resistance that has come towards ICE agents and any potential violence that is happening from ICE agents that are doing their jobs, regardless of the debate about excessive force and things like that. But that's been like the justification why there's military backing for ICE, is for, I guess, protecting ICE officers.
These deployments started in June 2025 when ICE raids targeted illegal immigrants at a garment factory and a hardware store downtown. It quickly escalated when protesters clashed with agents at the detention facility. Federal agents fired tear gas and rubber bullets to disperse the crowds, while protesters threw rocks and bricks at the police vehicles while they were moving.
Interestingly, literally today, I was watching watching football, and there were multiple commercials that came on my TV, and it was like, this is a message to law enforcement in your area. It was like, you need to be doing your job to support the efforts of ICE and immigration, whether you're being like ordered to stand down by your officials. It's like, it's your patriotic duty to support this. And also it was a recruitment for people to actually work for ICE. It was saying, if you've seen these ads where it's like a $50,000 signing bonus, and you can get like tuition waivers if you will actually, work for ICE. But yeah, very interesting to see that. Just, never really seen anything like that in my life, coming through just like commercials, for football games, that type of political behavior. That does seem rather unprecedented to see that enter the just regular commercial media like that.
Police cars were abandoned in the middle of the highway, looting broke out, fires were all over the city. That's when 4,000 California Army National Guard soldiers were federalized by the government, and 700 Marines were sent to Los Angeles on a mission to quell the riots. And since then, the protests have regularly happened in ICE facilities around the country. But over the following months, the violence has slowly escalated.
I remember hearing this, but I don't know if any actionable steps have happened, that the Guantanamo Bay facility potentially being used for detaining immigrants. It's usually been for political prisoners of other countries and terrorists and things like that. But has anything actionable come from that yet? Either way, the U.S. does not have the facilities to do what they are trying to, or at least what their goals are when they're talking about like 1 million people, don't have the facilities to do that. Not in anything that can be seen as humane, I guess, in any way.
In July, a man opened fire on ICE agents during a raid at a marijuana facility. 2 months later, another man shot into an ICE transportation vehicle, killing a detainee.
Yeah, that
After
was
the
recent.
Assassination of political commentator Charlie Kirk, U.S. government officials began stating these domestic deployments went beyond immigration and crime control, and they were now necessary to fight domestic terrorism across the United States. Adam felt shocked by the amount of violence happening in his country. He hadn't experienced anything like this before in his lifetime. His dad said it reminded him of back in the 1960s when there were a string of assassinations, bombings, riots, and unrest in the country. But for Adam's generation, unrest wasn't supposed to look like this.
Yep. I was going to say that this is different for this generation. I'm glad he brought up, because it was one of the contextual things I wanted to bring up, which was one of the more famous deployments of troops in the United States for civil issues was during the civil rights movement. Now, some of it started in the 50s with integration of schools for, white and black American children. There was the famous, one where President Eisenhower had deployed the Arkansas National Guard during the desegregation, early days of Little Rock High School. Look into that story. It's called the Little Rock Nine. Again, there was these African-American students that were being integrated into schools and to protect them from potential violence. And you can see some of the pictures in the film where there was protesters there outside the school, and they're trying to intimidate, the kids that are trying to go to school, and the National Guard was there to protect them. Also, the deployment of guards for civil rights marches. Famous one of Selma to Montgomery to support protests, by Martin Luther King Jr. But others have been in response to riots rather than just preventative, say the LA riots of the early 1990s. Protest movements that were also in relation to the Vietnam War. One famous example was at Kent State, where some students were actually killed. More recently, you might have heard of troops, deployed because of protests and civil unrest in Ferguson, Missouri, as a response to the shooting of Michael Brown. Death of Freddie Gray in Baltimore in 2015 under police custody, especially in 2020 with the death of George Floyd and BLM protests. Then also famously with the breach of the Capitol on January 6th of 2001. So you combine those with the natural disasters, and that's where this is a little bit different, because it is on a larger scope, even with the history of using National Guard for immigration deportations, because the goals, and you can see how fast and at such a large scale they're trying to do this, that is much bigger than the historical examples that we have. Anyway, let's keep going.
Yet behind the scenes, government memos and intelligence reports have been quietly reframing the threat, turning internal disorder into a matter of national security. In January, Latin American drug cartels were designated foreign terrorist organizations. Then, on September 22nd, the Trump administration officially designated Antifa as a terrorist organization.
And that is going to be unique because that is like Americans, participating in that. If it's something like ISIS or get any of the cartels that come from like Mexico or Venezuela. By the way, the use of terrorist designations is basically done to bypass a lot of, things that would regularly require votes like from Congress. But basically, you could just kind of get right through the red tape and actually do actions on foreign soil or international waters like you've seen with Venezuela cartels. But it really just cuts that red tape, which also people believe should be something that should be talked about, too, of limiting those democratic functions just because you can designate something a terrorist organization, which does not require all that much to get that designation. So could that be an abuse of power or a consolidation of power? And what precedent does that set for the future?
The first time a domestic group had been targeted in this way.
Yeah.
Antifa is a movement of leftist activists in the United States seen at many of these protests. The move to designate them as a terrorist organization was seen largely as symbolic, but it opened the door for the Pentagon to justify using their intelligence, surveillance, and even military assets within the interior of the country.
Right.
This same argument has been reinforced across multiple federal reports.
Same argument happened after the attacks of 9/11 in 2001. You had the passing of the Patriot Act, which allowed the government to increase surveillance on even civilians and at home under the threat of, terrorism. And that was very much and has still been very debated about the ethical nature of that, of becoming a, surveillance state because of the threat of terrorism.
And the Homeland Security 2025 Threat Assessment devotes major sections to domestic extremism and terrorism. The use of military force in America has always been a sensitive subject throughout history. Since the founding of the country, Americans have been suspicious of domestic troop deployments.
Right.
The framers of the Constitution had lived through British troops patrolling the streets, enforcing taxes, and even living in their private homes.
To show you how serious it went in as the Third Amendment to the Constitution, something that was seen as like undebatable, as something that needed to be included to ratify the Constitution. Third Amendment of quartering troops. Context of that, of course, was, the years leading up to the Revolution, where the British would basically put their own guard, right, in American cities to try to enforce taxation policies and protect against potential riots and protests. It's always that amendment, the Third Amendment, has always been the one that's been most peculiarly looked at by students when we talk about it. It's like, wow, it's like you have this list of these amendments which are so cherished in our culture, when you have freedom of speech and freedom to bear arms and religion, right, and due process and trial and all this stuff. And then just like squeezed in there, you have like quartering of troops. But it does indeed show how like fearful it has been and how much of an impact it has had in history, in American history, of having government troops stationed, and how people perceive that as such a threat and an abuse of power.
British troops killed 5 colonists in the Boston Massacre, which was seen as a warning of what could happen when a military is turned inward. So the founders built safeguards into the new republic to try to prevent that. The Third Amendment banned troops from living in civilian homes, and Article 2 placed command of the military under an elected civilian president.
And basically that only means for you now, if, let's say there are troops, National Guard troops that are in your city, and for whatever reason they knock on your door and say, hey, we want to stay here and you got to feed us and stuff. You do have the constitutional right to, remove them, but that's about it.
But that principle was tested almost immediately. In 1794, farmers in western Pennsylvania revolted against a new federal whiskey tax. President
Whiskey
George
rebellion.
Washington called up state militias to suppress the uprising. The rebellion did collapse, but it exposed the problem. There was no method through which the president could legitimately call up soldiers on U.S. soil to protect the republic. To fix that oversight, Congress passed the Insurrection Act of 1807, giving presidents the power to deploy federal forces domestically authority, but only when a state requests help or when local authorities can no longer maintain order.
So that becomes okay. So it's like you have this thing of requesting help, which again, you see is going to be very common in states that have like natural disasters. But there wasn't help necessarily requested in some of the deployment of some of these troops into these cities. In fact, it's been very openly criticized by, like mayors. But it looks like there's also a loophole in here when he's saying here that I guess it can be deemed justified if, I guess, by some criteria they say that the local enforcement isn't doing its job. But is that like too vague of a justification that you can just, claim that local law enforcement can't do their job anymore? Because then it actually becomes debatable.
Now, 2 centuries later, the Trump administration is signaling they may use the Insurrection Act if cities do not comply with immigration raids and National Guard deployments. And the nation's third largest city, Chicago, is at the center of all of this. In September, federal ICE agents in full tactical gear and camouflage launched Operation Midway Blitz. The Pentagon reported they authorized civilian law enforcement units from this to stage from an active U.S. military naval base at Naval Station Great Lakes, about 40 miles north of downtown Chicago. It's the largest military base in Illinois with infrastructure for vehicles, helicopters, staging, and intelligence collection. And it was the first time there was this level of cooperation between the military and civilian law enforcement. 250 federal agents using 140 vehicles launched immigration raids from the naval base. On the night of September 30th, agents rappelled from a Black Hawk helicopter on the roof of a 5-story apartment building in the South Shore neighborhood of Chicago, where officers say Tren de Aragua cartel members were using it as a safe house. Armored Bearcat vehicles, unmarked SUVs surrounded the block and established a perimeter.
You could definitely see a political goal is to tie all of these things together about drug trafficking as well as, illegal immigration. There's been so much debate about that is being used to, I guess, poison the well about undocumented immigrants in the country, that it implies that there's this huge number of them that are actually engaging in these type of, like drug trafficking activities and other harmful behaviors.
Officials claimed the raid had resulted in over 40 arrests and seizure of illegal narcotics and firearms. Local residents described the scene as a war zone. Shortly after this, a judge in Illinois ruled that the National Guard deployment was illegal, which temporarily blocked deployments while it went to the higher courts.
What was the claim that they said, on what grounds was it illegal? It's because it wasn't asked to be brought in to, help the situation, or that it doesn't meet the criteria of saying that they're ineffective at stopping these illegal activities?
Ultimately, it's up to the courts to decide if the troop deployments are legal,
right.
And the precedent rests on one single law from the 1800s, because after the Civil War in 1865, U.S. troops occupied the southern states to enforce Reconstruction and protect newly freed Black Americans from violence.
I can't believe I haven't brought that up yet. I mean, that was there forever. It was basically like years. With the passing of the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments, that gave voting rights and citizenship rights to, former slaves. The big fear that was after the Civil War that those things would not actually be protected. So you brought in those troops. Yeah, that might be the most intensive actual use of National Guard. And I hadn't brought that up yet. And can't believe I didn't think of that first.
For more than a decade, the Army occupied the South, but the presence of troops on the streets fueled resentment in the South, so President Hayes withdrew troops, and a year later, Congress passed the Posse Comitatus Act.
There was also some backdoor dealings with that, because the South hated, of course, having those troops, and they had to make agreements that they would actually protect that stuff. But unfortunately, a lot of that didn't happen. What you ended up getting is a passing of the black codes and other types of legislation without being so blunt about it, was designed to be restrictive to people of former slave ancestry of being able to, actually participate in their given rights. What ended up also coming out of it was the pardoning of Confederate leaders that were still around at this time. So yeah, you can put Hayes in that. It's one way he got, it's a way that he got the presidency, was to be able to make those deals with Southerners.
which
get
made
those
it
votes.
illegal to use the U.S. military to enforce domestic law unless Congress specifically authorizes it. But today, the president is using a different legal
Congress has
authority
not done that
to
with this.
avoid that issue. The government is deploying the National Guard without congressional or local state leadership approval by using Title 10 U.S. Code 124006. It allows the president to activate the Guard if the U.S. is, quote, invaded or is in danger of invasion by a foreign nation.
And you've probably heard that designation, used that immigrations are immigrations are a foreign invasion. So I guess that can be a way to kind of go through the gray areas in immigration law and also laws that can invoke the use of federal troops. You see all the kind of like trying to maneuver around the wording, that we have in our laws. In the US, we have been very guilty of writing laws in a very vague way. It's why our judicial system has been so important in history with how vague even things like our Constitution are. How it makes our judicial systems and courts and judges have a lot of political power, even though that wasn't supposed to be the idea of what judges in the judicial system is supposed to be was, apolitical, but it's pretty much impossible not to be.
Where there is a rebellion or a danger of a rebellion. In cities like Los Angeles, Portland, and Chicago, it's drawn lawsuits that have temporarily blocked the deployment of National Guard troops, putting them in limbo while the courts determine if there is legal danger of a rebellion. In addition to this, the federal government is now trying to deploy out-of-state Texas National Guard units to Chicago.
I've heard of that one.
Because the Texas governor agrees and supports the move. The laws written in the aftermath of the Civil War
so basically saying, well, if you're not going to use your National Guard or whatever, then we're going to send it from somewhere else. And that did go into, and I was telling you about those TV ads, maybe you've seen them too, where it was literally telling law enforcement people in the ad that you basically have a national duty to, I guess, pretty much disobey the orders that may come from your, the stand down orders that may come from your, law enforcement leaders, that you need to actually be, I guess, listening to the instructions given by federal leaders.
And to help settle the debate over domestic use of military force. But history shows us those limits have been tested again and again.
Right.
U.S. Army soldiers were deployed to crush the Great Railroad Strike of 1877, where they fired on rioters in several states, killing more than 100 civilians. Later, in 1957, President Eisenhower, the one who ran that last major deportation operation, invoked the Insurrection Act to enforce desegregation laws, integrating black and white schools. In 1962, Kennedy sent the National Guard to quell riots when racist mobs defied federal authority to allow the first black student to attend the University of Mississippi.
Talk about that recently.
2 were killed and hundreds injured before order was restored. In 1970, Ohio Army National Guard soldiers opened fire and killed 4 unarmed students during Vietnam War protests. But the last time the Insurrection Act was invoked was in 1992 by President Bush Sr. to help end the Los Angeles riots. Nearly 30 years later, in 2020, we saw 40,000 National Guard activated on the streets in response to riots after George Floyd's murder. Since 1970, though, no civilians have been killed by U.S. troops on U.S. soil. As for the soldiers themselves carrying out these missions, like Private First Class Reyes, they're bound by multiple laws and regulations that date back to 1939, forbidding them from engaging in partisan politics or criticizing Congress or the president in public.
I guess then it says, forbidden from engaging in partisan politics, but when you're ordered to do something, is that actually engaging in partisan politics? I guess that's debatable. I mean, a lot of people saying that these orders are given out in response to partisan politics. That puts these people in a very, difficult situation. These people that are being deployed, whether it's local law enforcement or like National Guard, that's got to be a tough situation to be in.
The U.S. military's culture is built on this idea of remaining apolitical, that service members follow lawful orders from civilian leaders regardless of who holds office. It's a principle meant to preserve public trust and keep the armed forces separate from partisan power.
Well, and historically, one of the problems, though, has been, like you're saying, they're apolitical, but they are given orders by politicians. Right. And what has become scary in other parts of the world is when, soldiers are given their orders from the military itself rather than the elected leaders. We see military coups all the time, and that's exactly what happens. You have some military leader who, again, has the devotion of his own troops and is able to carry out an order that may end up, leading in a takeover of a coup of a politically elected, democratically elected leader in some case. So I guess that brings in the question, who should troops, inevitably be getting their orders from? What if their military leaders say one thing and then the elected leaders say one thing? Because remember, the president of the United States, he is the commander in chief. I mean, he is the leader of the military. It's how it's written as far as delegation of powers, in the United States. But that's also not to say, because we've seen the historical precedent all over the place, that some military leader may be able to circumvent that and do their own military coups. It's a story as old as time, going back to Julius Caesar, right? And his troops basically doing his bidding, even if like the Roman Senate, which is going to be elected, may have other thoughts to that. Happened all over with African or Latin American leaders in, recent decades as well.
In theory, that apolitical line is clear, but in practice, it can get messy. The National Guard is unique in that it answers to two different governments at once, the federal government and the state governments.
Right.
In America, each of the state governors control the National Guard. Mm-hmm. The way it works is if a National Guard unit is called up by its state governor, it can operate what's called hybrid status. This is known as Title 32. Under this status of Title 32, guardsmen are legally not restricted by the Posse Comitatus Act, which means they're allowed to support police with crowd control, arrest individuals, search vehicles, and enforce curfews.
And we've seen that plenty of times.
The way it works in practice, and I've seen it firsthand before, individual guard commanders almost always explicitly tell lower enlisted soldiers in the past that they're not authorized to enforce the law anyway. They do this in order to avoid the legal issue of the Posse Comitatus Act altogether, even though they are legally allowed. However, when the National Guard is federalized directly by the president, it operates under their control or federal authority called...
This is where this can scare people, I think, a lot too, when you have your local leaders versus like your national leaders. And let's be honest, it still comes down to what you think of that person. Is it somebody that you shared political beliefs with? You're part of the same political party. Maybe you voted for them, but it's like, okay, what if you voted for the governor, but then you didn't vote for the president? Well, you're probably going to be more inclined to be like, well, I support, in this instance, what the governor thinks. And then it might be the opposite thing where it's like, I don't like my governor, but I like the president. It's like going to be political, like no matter if you like it or not. And I'm not just saying if you are somebody in like the National Guard, but just a person trying to make an opinion on it, just a civilian.
Title 10. That's president. It operates under their control or federal authority called Title 10. That single distinction means troops follow the same law as the active duty army, which means they cannot make arrests or enforce civilian law. Except that's not the full story, because there's an exception to that rule. Take a look at DoD Directive number 3025.18. This is being interpreted today to justify soldiers who are on Title 10 federalized orders to still perform law enforcement duties. Section 4K subsection 2 states federal military forces can act when local, state, or federal authorities are unable or unwilling to provide adequate protection for federal property or federal governmental functions. This is being interpreted by the federal government to mean anywhere that federal agents go, military soldiers can protect them. So the government is arguing that means federal ICE agents, when they go on raids, soldiers can go and protect them on that.
Right.
While lawyers argued about constitutional authority and whether or not the Illinois deployment would be reauthorized, Adam Reyes slept for the night on the floor of a gym in a Chicago armory. He texted his girlfriend and tried to get some reading done for school. A platoon of the Texas Army National Guard were staying in the same armory with them, and one of the guys from the Texas unit came over and joked, "So what happens if your governor orders you to stop us from being here?
Yeah, for real.
We're gonna have to square off in the parking lot?" The two laughed together. Across the country, several governors are threatening to withdraw from the National Governors Association.
True of an issue.
Which was originally created to help coordinate between the state governments and the federal government. More and more state governments are now acting like opposing camps. National Guard troops from Republican and Democrat states are being given conflicting orders.
Yep.
For soldiers on the ground, it raises a question. What happens if one state's governor orders their National Guard troops to do something in opposition to another state's National Guard? Adam is, of course, a representation of the thousands of National Guard soldiers across the country. He's a representation of the responsibility that these men and women have. Right. Many American soldiers over the past 250 years have stood in the same difficult position. They've had to make challenging split-second decisions and do their best to maintain their professionalism. The National Guard soldiers stand in the middle of court battles, presidential orders, civilians, and federal agents, but at the end of the day, all they really want is what's best for their communities that they grew up in and call home. I often cover wars happening halfway around the world. We've done rundowns on the Israeli-Hamas war, Ukraine, Russia, Venezuela.
Yeah.
It would have felt wrong for me to ignore one of the biggest issues in national security right now. Yeah. And I do believe that YouTube is a place where we can all come together and have discussions, because I think this is part of some of the biggest issues facing America right now. And it's important for this community to be a part of that discussion.
Yeah. It's like, if we can't talk about our foreign intervention, which we can, then we should definitely be talking about it, at home. If not, I mean, we should probably be talking about it more, because it's directly affecting, American civilians. So I think these issues and just the idea about like knowing where are we at as a country when it comes to how these types of things can happen, who is actually in control. Can you deploy, again, troops in your own country? And then where does that jurisdiction lie, and who has it? And how do we have it on our books even right now about where does the jurisdiction lie, and where do those powers actually come from? In what ways can they actually be enforced? It's amazing how, instances like this, we actually find out that we don't actually have a lot of clarity on this kind of stuff. And it's so important because of what the outcomes can be of things like this, where you're deploying federal troops in your own country. Again, we've seen it time and time again in so many different countries where stuff like this leads to major, major events, right? We get military coups. Dictatorships can be born this way. So it's so important to know what are our laws, because again, precedent is so important when you do make a decision based on whatever interpretation you have of the justification of these types of things. It will inevitably lead to these decisions being made by people in the future. So doing, I guess, the right way, whatever that is pretty important, and that you adhere to that. Otherwise, if the rules don't apply and if we don't know what the rules are, then why do we have rules in the first place? And then it just justifies that might is right. And that becomes, I think, a very dangerous threshold to cross. Final thoughts. All right, I guess that last little monologue kind of summed up a lot of my thoughts here going down, which is how important it is for us to know what our laws are when it comes to things that are so important in history. Again, like who controls troops in our own country when you deploy them in our own country? We have this balance of state government versus federal government. It's what our whole country has been built on, as a compromise of those things based on the context of what founding fathers and people that were around when our country was founded and what they dealt with, as colonies of like a foreign power. And like they're saying in this video, sometimes stuff like this doesn't happen that often. So you get these new generations of people that haven't experienced this, that of course that society at that time does not know what are our laws, because we haven't used them before. So we should be constantly, I guess, re-examining the things that are probably most important to the foundation of our country. Like, who's in charge? Who should be in charge? Because those are questions that probably have to continually be asked, especially as we look at history and see similar types of situations and what they've led to, both in our own country and abroad, because history is a way of learning lessons, learning how the world works. So with that being said, I thought this was very interesting to look at. It's obviously going to keep unfolding because it seems like we are in the midst of this, and the debates are going to continue to rage on here in the next months and probably years. And most importantly, decisions are being made right now that are going to be looked at by the people of the future that are going to inform their decisions. And we as a society will feel those effects. So it's probably important that we get it right, whatever that is. All right. We'll see you next time.